Alcohol. Is a Christian allowed to drink or not? What does the Bible actually say about this? And lastly, is there something that the heart cannot live without? Welcome to my channel, That Michelet Guy. If you've never been here before, what exactly do? We read the book of Proverbs. We read it slowly, word by word, term by term, in its mother language, Hebrew. This is what it was written in. It's meant to be understood in these contexts. Hebrew is this very complex language. Most of these terms have layers of meaning, and they don't really necessarily translate to English so well. So that's what we do, is we go back and we unpack them in their full context and see if there's additional wisdom that can be gained by reading them this way. So we're going to go ahead and jump into today's lesson. This is Proverbs 21 from the King James Version, English translation. This is, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. So if we had to summarize this in one single sentence, how would we do it? Well, we'd say that substance abuse will derail wisdom and it tanks relationships. And that'd be an adequate teaching. That's what most people would walk away with, and then they'd go and read Proverbs 20 verse 2 and so forth and so on. But that is not what we do here. So let's look at this in Hebrew now. In Hebrew, this is let's hayayin, home shakar, v'kol shoge bolo yecham. And word by word from a concordance, that is a mocker, the wine, roaring, strong drink, and everyone going astray by it will not become wise. So this first term, let's. So this is the subject of the first clause, and it's a singular noun. This is what the wine itself is going to be compared to. And we've done Proverbs about the let's. This proverb actually isn't about him. He's just being compared to him, but he's a stock character. He makes 14 appearances in the Proverbs, and it's usually translated as either the scorner, the mocker, or the scoffer. And that's because it comes from this primitive stem root verb called lutz, which means to scoff or to mock or to ridicule. And there's three primary major fool types. They're always the enemy of wisdom, but they're each the enemy of wisdom in their own way. So the petit, he's the ignorant one. He just doesn't know any better. Nobody's ever taught him anything. He's young. He's inexperienced. The casil, he's the one who's stubborn. As people have tried to teach him, he just doesn't want to listen. He doesn't learn. He doesn't take the correction. But the let's, this is the one we're talking about now. He's the worst of all the fool types because he's a full-blown cynic. Not only does he not listen like the casil, but he dismisses wisdom just on its face. And it's coming from a place of a hardened state of his heart. And because of that, he's the least likely to change anything about his lifestyle. He can't be persuaded. He can't be spoken to. And at his heart, the let's, he has this extreme arrogance and this pride, and he thinks that he knows better than everyone. And this is what makes him dangerous, is because then he turns around and takes that attitude and uses it to recruit other people to think the same way as him. And he gets them to distrust the common sense and the wise teaching, and he mainly does it through humor. He's kind of a clown. He enjoys being a sideshow and distracting anybody who's trying to teach wisdom. And you know, at the mildest form, he's just there for a joke and someone that we'd call a troll. But the more serious forms, they actually have like full-blown cynicism and contempt, and that's why he's oftentimes translated as the scorner, because in his heart he's actually a mean and contemptuous person. And the proverb's not leading here. Usually that first term is the most important term, but it's not leading with alcohol or the danger. It's beginning with this idea of character, this let's as a personality type, and that's a common form in the Proverbs, is prioritizing the character development, because that's what precedes any choice that any one individual is going to make. And so it's this partnering with alcohol that's going to reveal this character in the form of the kind of actions that this person's going to take. And a lot of times, just this sentence form, when you see in Hebrew that there's no verb, that means this direct connection is being drawn, and it means the noun actually functions as its own predicate. And so what it's saying is this wine is going to have an identical character trait to this let's, that it laughs off warning, it dismisses clear wisdom, and it ridicules danger rather than listening to it. And so in that sense, the word mocker is actually being left cleverly vague and open-ended by Solomon, because, and this is going to show his skills as a writer, because he's not specifying which aspect of mockery it's going to show itself, and he wants us to consider each of the possible meanings of mocker. So it means that the wine can mock the drinker's self-esteem. It can send him to a very dark emotional place. It can remind him of his own flaws, his own errors. It's laughing at him, it's mocking him, and it'll involve feelings of embarrassment and shame inside the drinker of the wine. Outwardly, it can turn the drinker into somebody who mocks others. So this is the let's. He'll act arrogant. He'll dismiss things. He'll be sarcastic. He's cynical. But it's also saying that the wine can mock just wisdom itself. It can laugh off sound decision making and good judgment. And the person who's intoxicated, they'll behave wildly. They'll take these unnecessary risks, and they remove their own restraint. And this is what actually impairs the judgment. So ultimately, this is not even about the let's as a full type. It's about the ability of wine to shape character. And it's saying that this wine, it has the ability to bend a person away from wisdom and away from good decision making. And It will make a person hostile to correction. It'll make them dismiss danger, and it'll also make them overestimate their own intelligence and their own humor. But it's saying that the wine will get the last laugh. It's actually going to mock the person who's going to find out the hard way that, yes, this stuff has danger. So our next term, ha'ayin, this means the wine. And so this is the continuation of the clause. And this is where there's no verb, but there's an implied predicate of is, and it's going to say that this is what's going to behave like the mocker. And when you see words in Hebrew begin with ha, that's a definite article. It means the. And so this is going to be about an entire category. It's a broad topic. And the word ayin, it doesn't have a primitive root. It doesn't even have a clear origin. It's a Semitic term that appears across many, many languages that just seems to mean fermented juice. It was inherited into the Hebrew language. And it's important to remember that in the ancient Near East, where these are coming from, wine was just a normal agricultural product. It's the vines, they grew everywhere, both wild and cultivated. So there was nothing exotic or fancy about wine. It was an ordinary crop that just came out of the ground, just like wheat or olive oil, and it was a part of daily life. So wine culturally was also this gigantic part of celebration and ceremony, and also religious observance. So wine is connected to gladness and feasting and weddings, and the priests themselves would offer it during religious ceremonies. And in that sense, wine is also, it's a metaphor. It's the culmination of an entire year's worth of work. So it's very symbolic. And many times in the Bible, wine is used in this metaphorical sense to mean joy. And it's a kind of a symbolism that means that eventually there is a payoff for endurance and laboring through, difficult times. But when you encounter the word wine in the Proverbs, it's always cautionary. It's about the personal pitfalls that a person could have, where it's about self-indulgence, and it's always saying, like, this is a yellow light, proceed with caution. And the proverb doesn't want us to be on guard against something alien and exotic. What it's saying is that, at the time it was written, that this is about something very mundane, very familiar. And what Solomon is stressing here is that wine has this dual nature. Yes, it can bring everybody together for celebration, but it also has this terribly destructive power. And if you're a person with an ungoverned appetite, it's actually going to ruin the acquisition of wisdom. It can rule over the person. And that's why the comparison to a person is very intentional. He wants us to see wine and alcohol in general as having a personality type. And he's also saying that this idea of an excessively indulgent lifestyle can make someone become a letz, that they will become this enemy of wisdom because they dismiss and ridicule wise counsel. And the letz, his whole thing is that he thinks life is one big joke. And if you try to tell him about dangerous things or warn him, that gets in the way of the good time. You don't want to hear it. So he's very used to laughing everything off. And it's saying that, okay, no, wine's actually going to laugh at you in the end. And so our next term is homer, and it gets translated as roaring. So this is an active participle, and it's a descriptive unit. It's going to tell us there's a little mild transition here to a different form of alcohol, and it's going to tell us how that alcohol is going to symbolically behave. And the primitive root for this verb is hama, which means to be restless, to roar, to be loud, or to stir up. So semantically, it implies commotion, and that's why many of the translations will translate hama as boisterous. And it's ironically, this is the same verbal root that the word hamas comes from, which means violence. And but the idea with homet in this proverb is it really wants us to focus on the idea that this is both a destructive motion, but it's also loud sounds. And it's the idea that things are loudly being stirred up, churned up, turned over. And so in that sense, it's the opposite of peace and quiet. And probably the closest English term would be the idea of chaos, and that's what's going to link to the next term, shakar, which is strong drink. And it's saying that shakar is going to do more than just intoxicate you. It's going to create turbulence, and the idea is that it's so loud that it can't be ignored or missed. Everybody's noticing that this is so loud. And it's also a beautiful demonstration of the depth of the Hebrew language, because hama is also an idiom that means internal disturbance. So this is a person inside is also loud, that their soul and emotions are unsettled, that they don't have peace and quiet, that they're so disordered that they can't simply relax. And that movement is a real key to this proverb, because mocking, this is subtle, this is at a distance, but noise and tumult, this is not. It's very, very present, and it's very undeniable. So it's showing this progression from this low intensity problem to a high intensity one. So it's moving from something that's contained internally to something that has gone outward, that it's completely unrestrained. It's just out. And it's also the difference that a person's thoughts might mock him silently, quietly, away from everybody, but there's a difference if his thoughts are actually fighting him or fighting other people. And he's moving from just simply unteachable, which is the let's, to now he's actually lawless, and that's homer. And That's why a lot of the translations will translate this part of the proverb as beer is a brawler, because it's showing that there's two different types of substances, two different personality types, and there's two different levels of danger. So our next term, shakar, means strong drink, and this is what we'll be doing the roaring. So this is the second of the two analogies, and this comes from a primitive root, shakar, which means to be intoxicated or to be drunk. And shakar is a different category from wine because distillation did not exist yet. Wine on its own usually hits an alcohol by volume around 8 to 12%, but these higher potency drinks, this shakar that this proverb is referring to, those usually came from like honey or dates or pomegranates and grain, and so they'd actually hit way higher alcohol, like 15, 20 plus, and so they're basically they're double strength. And shakar was almost always used to soothe the pain of somebody who's dying or was in terrible pain, and it was highly restricted. Levites and priests, they really weren't supposed to touch it. And there was just a general social discouragement against strong drink. And the big difference is that wine, it has ceremonial value, and it could be used for all these other different things. But shakar, it was really for one thing, is to get drunk. And the grape harvest, this comes once a year. And so you get this one opportunity to ferment it and create the wine. But shakar, you could grab that, basically any time. And so this proverb, what it's actually doing right now is it's establishing escalation. That the person who's drinking wine, they have a thin alibi, but it is an alibi nonetheless. But the person who has this strong drink, they're just doing it to get drunk. And the wine drinker might be able to ignore his problem, like the mocker. He can dismiss it. But the strong drink, it's roaring. Everyone recognizes it. It's a problem for him and everybody. And this turbulence, it's undeniable. The volume's loud for him and everybody. And what Solomon's actually doing here by showing these two contrasting forms of alcohol and their expression is he's showing that problematic drinking is multifaceted. It's going to show up in different ways in different people, and that's why he's comparing it to sound. He's showing that there's high and low volumes, and he doesn't want the message of his proverb to just be some simple basic platitude like alcohol is bad for you. He wants you to consider the ways. He wants you to think about the hows and the whys, and he wants you to think of all the different forms that alcohol abuse is going to have an impact on a person's life. It's going to be their internal peace. It's going to be their emotional stability. It's going to be their social relationships, their reputation, their ability to have reflective clarity, and just soundness of mind in general. And even more than that, what he actually wants us to think about is what's going to be discussed in the second half of the proverb, is how does it impact wisdom being formed, which that's a great segue to the back nine, the second half of the proverb. And our first term is vekol, which means and everyone. And this is going to be a supplement to the first clause. So many of the proverbs, they follow a contrasting form. They're going to show you the wise thing and the foolish thing, or the righteous thing and the unrighteous thing. But this is going to take the thoughts of that first clause and it's going to expand on them. And it's going to do this by telling us who this is going to apply to. And so there's no primitive root here on either of these terms. Ve is just a generic conjunction, means and then kol means all. And it's a very small term, but what Solomon's really trying to do here is he's moving this from a descriptive thing, which is the first, and now he's moving it to how does it look when it's applied. And he wants us to understand this is a universal message. This applies to everyone. And this is the hinge that is actually going to move the discussion away from the substances, and it's going to move it towards the soul of the person himself. And the tendency of people is to think that the bad thing is what happens to other people. This can't happen to me. And the proverb is saying, no. Any habitual user, this is what's going to happen. They're going to go astray, which, great segue to the next term, shoget, going astray. And so this is also a participle, and this is in the kal form, which we've talked about plenty. And kal is all about the patterns, the general tendency, and this is going to establish what will happen to the drinker. And when you pair it with kol, all, that means that there's an axiom that's actually being established, that there's no suspense, there's no wonder how this is going to turn out. This is what's going to happen to anyone who goes astray in this way. And this term, shaga, is really the key to understanding this proverb because it has so many layers packed into its meaning. And so that primitive root, shaga, it means to wander. It also means to make errors. It means to stray off course. And it also means to be misled yourself. So if you've ever heard the Yiddish term meshuga, it means to be crazy. And the idea is that it's saying that the person's mind can't even see the truth. And the Proverbs loves to use this imagery and the symbolism of paths, because many times we'll discuss like a term like derek, which means the straight path. And shaga, this is the opposite. This is the departure. This is going off course. This is meandering. This is wandering. And a path is all about the repeated choices a person makes again and again and again, step by step. And when you do that, you establish that there's a direction, that there is a destination. And wisdom wants us to connect all of these things together to say that choices have outcomes. And the idea of folly is not that a person has a single wrong opinion in a single case. It's a matter that they make continuous bad decisions again and again in a reliable manner. And shoget, this is the first step that takes a person off the path of wisdom. It's the person giving themselves a permission slip to exit that path. And A giant part of Hebrew's depth is its ability to package multiple facets into a single term, and shagah is going to be a textbook example of this. So the first thing that shagah does is it identifies the action itself. And that's why many of the English translations call it straying, but it also establishes the consequences, which is the error. And that's why many translations call it, erring. But the last thing that it does is it actually identifies the underlying cause. Why did this all happen? And that's why a lot of translations call it being misled. And the King James Version here uses the term deceived. And none of these translations would be wrong. It's just that English doesn't have an equivalent word that can express all three things at the same time in one term. So they're all bundled here. It's explaining what happens, what the result is, and why it happened. And that's why Hebrew's explanatory power, it just has this precision and these morphology, these verbal forms that can be taken because they connect cause and effect. They remove the mystery and they establish who the actor is and what the action is, and that's why it's called Lashon HaKodesh. It's the holy tongue, is that there's certain things that in the spiritual realm, no other language does it better. And the whole idea is that this combination of shogeh with that conjunction vek means it's universal, that anybody who follows this path or this pattern, it's basically, it's like a math formula. Like you're going to create this result, and we don't have to speculate or wonder where this will all end. We know. And that's basically Solomon concluding that this is a universal occurrence. And so our next term, bo, it's very simple, means by it, and this is a basic preposition that first letter bet, it can mean by, in, with, or through. And what it's saying is that this is what straying is going to cause. And even though this term is very small, it's also fascinating and pivotal because it's going to establish the means. It's going to tell you how this happens. It's connecting, first of all, the substances in the first clause to the straying, but then once it has that established as a foundation, it turns around and connects that to wisdom itself being blocked. And when I was first learning Hebrew, identifying these single letter prepositions was a little difficult for me. And so the letter lamed or mem, these are about establishing direction. Those are the to and from prepositions. Kaf is about analogy. This is about like or according to, but the letter bet, this is always about relationships and connections. And that's why it usually gets translated as by, with, in, or through. So what it's actually saying here is that there's companionship. There's a bond that has been formed, that this drinker and this error, they're inseparable, that they come together. You can't unpackage them. They're commingled and they make these decisions jointly. So this man is not his own. Is that when you see one, you get the other. And as long as this connection exists, our final term is going to be the path's destination, which that's a great place to pivot to that term. And it's lo yacham. And so this is a negating participle, but it's in the future tense. So it's going to explain what will not and cannot happen. And what we're seeing here is this Proverbs more or less told a story. It's saying that the substances, the mocking of the wisdom, the wandering around, that they all kind of combine to create poor decisions, and it means that wisdom did not form. So that first word, lo, it's a basic negator. It means not or no. And yecham, so this is the future tense of the verb hacham, which we talk about that all the time. It means to be wise or to have skill. And that's the whole purpose of the Proverbs, is to teach a person how to live with skill. And it's the whole reason this channel exists, is to teach people skillful living. And the imperfect tense is very important to it, though. It means that this is not a past tense yet, that things can still change right now. It doesn't have to be this way, that there's an open timeline, that if he stops this shoga, all this wandering and error, that wisdom can actually form it, it can repair things. And when we look at the way that the book of Proverbs, Sefer Mishle, the way that it begins, under those first 7 verses, it lays out this very clear vision of the purpose of wisdom. It's almost like a company mission statement, and it tells you that it's to make the untrained person wise, and the person who's moderately wise to make them even better. And so that's the deal, is most of us have a basic level of knowledge. We're making it through life, decently okay, and we get some things right, but we get some things wrong, and so in that sense, we're all a mixed bag. But if you can get it right without getting it wrong, that's what wisdom is. It's the erasing of the commingling of error and correctness. And wisdom's not about scoring a 90, it's about scoring a 100. It means having none of the shogeh. And that's what the proverb here is actually concluding, that this process cannot begin if we have this bottle of booze in our hand. And we're going to have to set it down before we can see any progress. So now that we understand what these words mean individually, what we do now is we take a little step back and we'll do a little closer look. Okay, so when we get to this section of the video, what we do is we take this little step back and we learn to appreciate the proverb for just how it's arranged. These proverbs have this kind of internal logic about them, that the way that Solomon wrote and phrase these things is that they have multiple parallel trains of thought going at the same time. And we ask ourselves, well, why did he phrase it this way? Is there anything that was implied silently? And that's what will make these proverbs so fascinating is the multiple directions you can focus on and which way you want to go with it. So this first concept that we see being compared is obviously the intoxicants being used. So the idea of wine versus strong drink. And so wine, it's lower potency, and strong drink is high potency. Wine's got this celebratory and religious purpose and value. Strong drink has no value other than getting drunk. The wine, this is created once a year at harvest, but strong drink, if you've got grain stored up, you can whip it up and have a whole batch of beer in, 10 days. And the whole idea is that wine has these other purposes than intoxication, but not strong drink. And even though it's counterintuitive, wine might actually be a little bit more dangerous because it can be seen as less harmful, and so the person can use it and not even realizing that yes, you're the same as the person having the strong drink. It just looks different with you. And so in that sense, wine consumption can present itself as innocuous and controlled and normal, but strong drink, this kind of an addiction, this is going to be undeniable. Second concept that we see is the behaviors of the person, is the idea of the difference between mocking and roaring. So alcohol, it stimulates emotions. That's why it's called mood altering. And it means that its expressions will express differently in different people because we have different emotional starting points. And the idea is that mocking is this subtle thing that's probably not going to be noticed by other people. But roaring, this is loud. And in the translations that call it brawling, the idea is that this person, they're at war. They're having a fight inside themselves. It's tumult. It's turned up, and it's the difference between a person who maybe goes into a depressive state, where the mocker, the wine drinker, where they have this low intensity kind of feelings of doubt and pity, where they're ridiculing themselves. But the person with the chomeh, they're going to have this rage, this high intensity. They're battling. And that's the idea is on the emotional side, does a drinker go to a shame-based depressive state, or do they go to a violent, aggressive, confrontational state? And the idea is that dysfunctional drinking can be soft and manageable, or it can be loud and unmanageable. Third concept that we see is the idea of the paths. So it specifically names wandering, shogeh. Well, there's an implied contrast to that, which is the straight path. And this proverb doesn't follow that standard template of naming the contrast, but it is implied in that second clause. And Shogeh's richness is the idea that error and wandering and being misled, it has this silent antonym, and that is yashar, which means to see very clearly and to be able to walk this straight path, to be led by wisdom. And in math, they call this point symmetry, or the odd function, is that the opposite actions in the equal and opposite measure will have an equivalent distance of result. And there's this idea that there's this point symmetry, that the person who's keeping shomer, a straight path, that as dysfunctional as this person's life is on this side of the thing, that's how much more functional theirs will be by following the path. And that's where that word bo, by it, phrasing it in the antonym would mean that the dysfunctional didn't accompany the person who didn't choose it, only the one who did. So these little terms, they mean something. And then the fourth concept that we see is the idea of wisdom itself, that, obviously this proverb is talking about the person who lacks it. Well, the implied contrast is the person who possesses it. And the proverb showing these multiple examples of how to fill. It shows the three different influences: wine, strong drink, and wandering. And so ultimately, this whole proverb was about rejecting wisdom in the first place and ignoring the clear pattern that an alcoholic lifestyle will lead to ruin. And it didn't mention that the person who did not make these choices, but it means that the inverse is also true, that alcohol cannot fight you and it cannot mock you if you stay on the path of sobriety. So the sound and wise mind, they don't even dabble with the addictive substances. So we could spend all day here looking at these aspects of these concepts, but we're going to go ahead and move on to the recap. But it's always nice to take that little pause and step back and to recognize this is the whole reason why we read the Mishle slowly, so that we can visualize the proverb operating at these multiple wavelengths. And when we do that, then we can contemplate it from these different angles, and we can gain more perspective, and we'll capture things that we would miss if we read it too quickly. And it's a chance to see how gifted Solomon was as a writer, and recognize that these proverbs, they're not just simple adages. And but let's go ahead and move on to the conclusion. So Proverbs 21, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Translation, I give it a 10 out of 10, word for word, clause for clause, thought for thought. This is fantastic. So what can we take away from this? Well, number one, Alcohol is mankind's oldest and original vice. It still has the power to reshape and ruin the mind, as well as the internal emotions a person feels, and ultimately the kind of actions they're going to take with others. And second thing that we take away is that addiction does not look the same in every single person. Sometimes it's obvious, and other times it's just going to be subtle, but it's always destructive. And then the last thing that we're going to take away is that wisdom, as always, keeps a person very far away from folly and error. And that means it keeps us away from pain and destruction. And that's why God wants us to choose it. And the Proverbs will teach us how to skip those parts of life. So now what we do is we actually take an even further step back, and we're going to do a series of guided talks to see how can we apply this, where does it talk to our heart, and where does it talk to our spirit. Okay, so the first of the guided talks is what we call the dad talk. And the dad talk is exactly what it sounds like. It's fatherly advice. It's where we read the proverb on the surface and we form it into something that we can use, something that's practical, that we can apply in life. So this is a proverb that's going to be about alcoholism, or really more or less being able to identify when alcohol is becoming a problem and when you need to stop. So we'll miss the point if we focus on the potency aspect of this proverb. Of this is not the difference between tequila, whiskey, and wine, and beer, and which one has more alcohol content. This is about the idea of, do you have identifiable negative consequences that are happening in your life related to drinking? So this would be, if you're getting DWIs, if you are getting disturbing the peace charges, this is a clear wake-up call. This means you need to stop immediately. You do not have this under control. This is not something that your life is manageable or functional if you're doing this. And in a weird way, the person who has a clear and obvious problem with alcohol, they don't suffer from self-deception or denial, and so they'll be able to identify the problem and quickly address it and change it. But if alcohol is causing you problems that it's happening, stop. It's also, at the time that this proverb was written, the most potent thing available to them was this idea of strong drink. But we live in the 21st century. There's a lot of other stuff out there now, so it can also be seen as a stand-in for what is socially acceptable versus what is socially unacceptable, or things that there's no safe amount to use. So like there's no way to have a manageable crack habit or using crystal meth or heroin. But the whole purpose in this proverb of using this idea of strong drink as a metaphor, that's how most people think that alcoholism looks, is someone living a wild life. It's the vast minority of cases. And the reason why most people suffer from alcoholism is because they think, since it doesn't look like that, I don't have a problem. So the second thing that we see is this metaphor of the wine. And this can be something that's seen as, like I said, less harmful or more socially acceptable. And so the assumption is that there's less danger or there's less damage. But this proverb is saying that, a hidden or a controlled addiction is still going to be an addiction. It doesn't have to look like raging for it to be destructive. And when we're looking at this idea of mocking, ridicule and mockery, these are the ideas of a person's value, of their self-worth. And people, they can escape a situation, but they can't escape their own internal thoughts. And so that's a quick diagnostic of if alcohol is sending you to these very dark emotional places where you're obsessed on your own flaws, your own failures. It makes you enter what they call the pity spiral. This is a huge red flag. Alcohol is not for you. You need to set it down. And raging and roaring gets everybody's attention, but depression's silent. It's experienced individually. No one else knows that it's happening. And that's the real danger of alcoholism, is that its worst damage is done outside of the view of other people. And so if the alcohol is mocking you, you set it down. You don't wait for it to roar. And then kind of like where we'll end out on this is, the Bible prohibits drunkenness, not consumption. So you can definitely drink alcohol. It is permitted. But there's a difference between can and should. Permissible does not necessarily mean wise. And so when we study Proverbs, they're not about exploring every possibility of what's available to you. They're about recognizing patterns and developing wisdom. And that's going to include exercising caution and recognizing danger. And so in that sense, this is not a groundbreaking observation to say that alcohol damages wisdom or can make a person make bad decisions. Sure, somebody might find some fun and enjoyment in it, but you'll never find wisdom or peace in that kind of a lifestyle. And the other thing is, we know a lot more about addiction now. We know that it actually carries genetic markers. So not everybody's playing from the same set of cards. And if you have people in your immediate family, in your distant family, that that this is something that your family struggles with, you probably don't even want to touch this stuff at all, because you don't know what's inside it. And it's especially horrible to those around you if you find yourself addicted to this thing, and then your problem becomes their problem. And so yes, the decision to drink or not, that's personal. But the proverb wants us to understand that the amount of wisdom that someone will acquire or operate in will be limited by it. So if wisdom is your goal, don't look for it in a bottle of booze. All right. And so the second of the talks is what we call the lev talk. The lev is the Hebrew word for the heart. And we do a segment in every single proverb about the lev, because the culture that these proverbs come out of, they have a different understanding of the way that they use heart versus the way that we use heart. It has a lot more responsibilities from the Hebrew wisdom culture. And we generally think of the heart as just a vague metaphor that means just something, anything going on inside. But the culture that these come out of, it's the lev is the command center of the entire person. It's responsible for processing all the information and then forming plans of actions. And so the lev, this is also where the will of a person is going to be. It's where wisdom gets stored, and it's where the relationship with God is going to begin. So in that sense, the lev is the primary contact point for everything. And this is what God is going to weigh and examine, because whatever's in the heart, that's the precursor to the person's actions. It's going to be able to tell you why the person's going to do what they do because of what's in the heart. And so in that sense, success or failure in life will depend on how seriously a person takes the responsibilities in their lev. And so on its surface, this is a proverb that's about alcohol and addiction. But the conclusion is that, it ends up that you're not going to find wisdom there, but subtly tucked in the proverb is that this is actually a proverb that's about emotions. And one of the biggest enemies of wisdom is having emotional instability. And when the heart is not at rest, when it's not at peace, it can't think or operate clearly. And for that reason, it won't behave rationally. And we know that alcohol is something that distorts emotions because it actually changes the chemistry inside the brain. And through that lens, we're actually we're looking at two different emotions that are going to define when a person's drinking has moved from normal and has crossed a threshold and is now a problem. And it's going to be these two emotions, depression and rage, which symbolized here, and the way that Solomon has phrased it, is mocking and roaring. And so if a person has made the decision to drink, these are the emotions that they need to be on the lookout for. Does the alcohol bring this out of them? And most of the time, a person who's an alcoholic, what they're actually seeking is mind numbing, because alcohol provides this temporary relief. It shuts the brain down for a moment, and it's a great escape from their own problems and their own uncomfortable emotions, or so they think. But the first expression of this in the proverb is the pity loop, this cycle where Solomon compares it to a mocker. And what that is these are the internal thoughts of self-shaming that an alcoholic is going to feel, that this person is turning over and over and over and obsessing about their own failures, their own inadequacies. And so in that sense, it's almost like this negative voice that they hear in their head. And this is like a gun being pointed inward at their own self, and it's accusation on this endless loop. And it reinforces and cements the feeling of failure. And that in turn creates a need for the chemical escape that alcohol seems to be temporarily providing. So in that sense, it's a cycle, and it's just on repeat. And the person who's experiencing this inside, it's a shame that other people are not even going to see or realize it's happening. And this is what a silent addiction does, is the attacks are out of sight, except for the person experiencing them. And because of this person will also specialize in keeping them secret, of hiding them and smiling on the outside, covering their tracks, and keeping things all together. And so to the outside world, even to themselves, they can convince themselves that everything is fine. And an addiction that's under tight control and that is invisible to others means it's doing all of its damage in silence. And the second form of the bad emotions that an alcoholic is going to experience is what the King James Version calls raging, and that this Hebrew term homech calls roaring. But modern health professionals, they call it disinhibition. And it's because alcohol can remove the part of the mind that governs themselves with restraint. So this is like a vehicle with no brakes, and this is a person who doesn't care who notices or who gets hurt, and they're not hiding anything. They're letting it all hang out, and rather than processing these emotions in secrecy, they just let the dysfunction have free reign. And this is where the first version was the guns pointed inward. These are the guns pointed outward. And that first person, they're doing public relations and damage control, but this person, this is the one who just doesn't care. They're going to do damage maxing. And that kind of a lifestyle, it's more than a willingness to have like a fist fight with a stranger. It's a willingness to disregard all caution and to take these huge risks, to live loudly and chaotically in the open, and as I say, in front of God and everybody. And so to bring it back to the heart, the lev, this proverb is showing two different types of emotions that are going to create ruin for a person, because they disrupt the ability of the lev to act as the internal governor. And that's where the word mishle comes from. It comes from a verb, mashal, which means to rule and to govern. And the first thing that a person learns to govern is their own self. And this is going to include their own personal thought life and their actions. And if alcohol is bringing either one of these two forces out of you, either depression or rage, your drinking habit is no longer healthy. So in that sense, that this proverb, it's actually a diagnostic tool, that if your thoughts mock or fight you, you need to set alcohol down. And that's what's at the center of this proverb is peace, internal peace. Emotional stability has been stolen, which is why that Hebrew word homeh is so fitting. It describes the lack of quietness, the lack of stillness in the heart. And all they have is turbulence and noise. And the chaotic kind of actions that are going to come out of a heart that's experiencing this is going to demonstrate that wisdom doesn't live here. And so that whole sense of homa, noise, fury, problems, this is a person who has no joy and no sound judgment in their love. And as we study these proverbs more and more, one of the things that I noticed when I first got into them is that the proverbs are as much about internal peace as they are about wisdom. In Solomon's writing, they show this tremendous insight in what modern science has confirmed, especially here, about the psychological underpinnings of addiction. And when we get deeper into the Proverbs, we're going to see this topic come up more and more because there are, plenty of them about addiction. And what we are doing is we're seeking wisdom, and the key foundation to forming wisdom is going to be that emotional stability, that when our heart is at rest, we actually make better decisions. We can access the wisdom that we stored, and we can see things more clearly. We don't need mood altering substances to numb our inner aches, because joy and wisdom already lives here in the Lev. And when we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we receive this joy, and through faith in Christ, we receive a comforter. And that's what's actually going to stabilize our mood if we'll lean into it. But if you or someone that you love suffers from this disease, this scourge of alcoholism or addiction, never underestimate what the power of repentance and prayer can do in the hands of a loving and forgiving God. And the healing that happens once a person has submitted this to the guidance and compassion of a merciful Savior is it's something that's amazing to watch. And there's a lot of Christian-based resources that can assist somebody who's suffering from this. And we're going to list a few of them in the show notes. And if you're viewing, leave a comment. If you know of others, please direct other people to them. And just never lose hope that it's Christ's joy is to heal this particular sickness specifically, and he replaces it with a newness of born again life. So what we do now is we're going to actually take a step further back, and we're going to look and see, where does this actually even speak deeper? Where does it speak to our spirit? Okay, and the last of the guided talks is what we call the Ruach talk. The Ruach, this is the Hebrew word for the spirit in motion. And when we get here, what we're trying to do is we're looking to see, where's a Christian message in this, which means, how does this link to Jesus? Is there something about Jesus's teachings in particular, some way that he lived his life? Is there something that is in the epistles? But we're looking for a timeless biblical message that's going to link the Old and the New Testament so that we can see that God's word is always the same yesterday, today, and forever. So looking at this, there's a lot of denominations that treat this word oinos. The New Testament was written in Greek, oinos. This is the Greek word for wine. And a lot of these Protestant sects will teach that any and all alcohol use is completely forbidden. And this, of course, is not biblically supported or even scientifically possible at the time that the scriptures were being written, because the technology to preserve fresh juice and prevent it from fermenting into wine, it didn't even exist till about 100 years ago. Juice would have to be temperature controlled, the yeast has to be inoculated, the oxygen has to be controlled, or juice just becomes wine on its own naturally. And biochemically, these wild native ambient yeast just start converting sugar to alcohol just on their own. So when the Bible says wine, it means wine, the kind full of alcohol. And Jesus' first miracle was turning water into wine. He compares his teaching to the fermentation process. He says it's like gases that would burst the old wineskins if you placed it in there. And naturally, his last meal was with his disciples, a communion meal celebrated with a cup of wine. And he even drank enough wine that was an accusation against him, that he's a drunkard. But so in that sense, wine is not a dirty word. It's not a sinful activity to enjoy it every now and then. And God gave it to us. It's a natural product that, again, it makes itself on its own. And when we look at the spiritual side of things, this is really more about the symbolism. And that's what we do in this segment of every video is we will understand that wine as metaphor is actually a key to understanding the Bible in general, because, here we are, we're so removed from agriculture in the modern world, but this was how time was measured in this world, was the harvest and the growing and planting season. Is wine would have been understood that this is the eventual payoff for an entire year's worth of work. So the wine is what actually made the back-breaking labor worthwhile, because the symbolism of this vineyard, it brings forth this abundance of fruit, and then that is what's turned into the wine that supplies celebration and feasting and worshiping for an entire year. And so in that sense, wine represents promise, it represents hope, and it's the ability to endure hardship because that the payoff comes later, and that it's what eventually awaits. And so in that sense, it brings people together. It represents joy and fellowship and celebration and the rest from work. Once it's harvested, you have to wait until the spring to begin again. And that's why this idea of wine is, in a symbolic sense, it appears again and again all over both the Old and the New Testament. And The people of the ancient world, they correctly saw it as God's generosity, as wine was seen as this gift that makes man's heart glad. So when you see oil in the Bible, that usually represents the Holy Spirit. Bread represents the provision of God. But wine, other than when it appears in the Proverbs, it's always deeply connected to the emotion of joy. And one of the most amazing observations about joy was made by Thomas Aquinas. And he has this very famous quotation: man cannot live without joy. Therefore, when he is deprived of true spiritual joys, it is necessary that he become addicted to carnal pleasures. And that's what we actually see when we honestly look at what's going on inside of the addict, is they have a heart that's not at rest because there's no spiritual joy in there. And we don't see their flesh operating under the leash of the heart, which we just talked about, the lev. We see the inverse. We see the lev is under the leash of the flesh. And this life has no meaning besides these like little small, fleeting, and short-lived physical pleasures. And this is a person who's been disconnected from their creator. And because of that, their spirit, the one inside, it's disconnected from the source of joy of what it was designed for. And that is relationship with God. The Bible also uses a lot of symbolism with slavery as well. And the shackles, they're standing for a lack of joy, a lack of freedom, a lack of options, and they represent cruelty and heaviness and exhaustion. And it's the inability to find lasting joy in anything. And it's the inability to stop one's own sinful behaviors. And so in that sense, addiction is like shackles. It's a tether, it's an anchor, and it constricts freedom of motion, and it limits the spectrum of emotion, particularly experiencing joy in its fullness, life in its abundance. And in Luke's gospel, after being tempted in the wilderness, Jesus, that's when he actually starts his public ministry. And he does it by reading from a scroll in Isaiah. And he declares that he's come to set captives free. And this is definitely a sign that he's fulfilling a messianic prophecy. Right afterwards, they try to throw him off a cliff, but that's besides the point. But when I went looking for Jesus in the proverb, I immediately thought of just how many people's personal testimony of redemption and change in spirit actually begins with rescue from the power of addiction. And there's just millions of people who claim to be one of those captives that Yeshua set free from what was enslaving them and stealing their joy. And that's where a lot of Jesus's miracles actually involve the restoration of function, and particularly the part of the body that's malfunctioning and ailing. So you see him healing the blind and helping those who have been immobilized, people who are bleeding, people who are epileptics, and yes, even people who suffer from mental illness. He can restore a sound mind. And billions of people, they keep telling the same story over and over and over across the centuries. I was a mess, then Jesus set me free. He's the one who repaired me. They're declaring I'm the captive who he set free. There's no ambiguity. They know exactly who did it. And our last proverb, we just recently discussed this concept of aven, and this is what sin actually does to the soul. It's the kind of emotions that sin makes us feel inside, and it's a very deep emotional concept. There's no English equivalent to this term. It's something that only the Hebrew word and language appropriately captures. That's Proverbs 22:8. Sowing iniquity and reaping aven. So when Jesus frees us from sin, he's also freeing us from something else. He's freeing us from the thing that is blocking our joy. He's releasing us from the oven. He calls it laying our burdens down and receiving his rest in exchange. And the lifting of that specific type of spiritual pain that no medical equipment or can measure or detect that is the appeal of the gospel, is being liberated to actually begin enjoying life. And once the spirit's awakened and responding to that joy that Christ uniquely offers, that's why the Christian loves him so much. It's the fact that they have this firsthand experience of salvation, and then this relationship that continues afterwards, and that it comes just uniquely from receiving his grace. This person, they know what they suffered from, and they know who ended it. They know where the joy comes from and what makes it possible, and they don't have to be able to explain the how, as long as they can boldly declare the who. And this is what will frustrate critics of the Christian faith. They can attack a person's ability to debate or present information, but they can never invalidate the testifier's personal rescue story. That person can simply repeat, just like it is in John's gospel, though I was blind, now I see. And at its heart, substance abuse and addiction, it always comes from a place where there's a need to escape, that this mood altering chemical can temporarily provide. But sadly, that's the closest that the person who's enslaved to the drink, who's shackled in their spirit, that's the closest that they'll ever get to what Christ offers, which is the opportunity to actually unload their internal burdens. And subconsciously, they're looking for comfort. They're looking for some form of relief. And even if they don't know it, even if they can't articulate, what they're actually looking for is joy. And that's the word simcha in Hebrew. But when we look at addiction, we're seeing something that pulls a person downward. Their entire inner life, their inner emotions are being compared to a mocker in this proverb. Their outward actions, it's being compared to tumult and chaos and noise. This is not the kind of life that God created a person to live in. But he does want you to come down, and just not in that way. He wants you to come down in humility, in spirit. And that's where the downward motion needs to be, is at the spirit level, not being proud like the Let's, so that you would be willing to mock and scoff at Christ's offer of relief. So whether you want to call it being humble in spirit, or picking up the cross, or surrendering, or just any other terminology, it's all the same thing. The space where joy becomes reality is embracing humility and allowing Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, to lift the weight, the sadness, and the dysfunction off of you, and to come to him, to reach to him in faith, and to come to him in this broken state, because it's written, who the Son sets free is free indeed. And that's the real wine that the Spirit actually wants, is this blood of the new covenant, is the joy and the freedom that's offered there. Because Christ doesn't just forgive sin, he removes it. He replaces it with joy, and he calls his process filling you with new wine. So yes, the world will offer a cup full of substances, but they only empty the soul. And Yeshua, he does the opposite. He offers you a cup that runs over. It sets you free, and it fills you with joy. So I think that's a good spot to stop. I hope you enjoyed this teaching and got something out of it. The world's a very dark place. We say all the time that it really needs wisdom to go out into it. It really needs the gospel to go out into it. And I hope that people are getting a lot out of these teachings. If you'd like me to break down a specific proverb, you can definitely email me, thatmishlei@gmail.com, ThatMishlei@gmail.com. The comparison that we use is life is this big giant test. And the Proverbs, the Mishlei, they're the ones that give you all the answers ahead of time. God wants you not only to pass the test, he wants you to ace it. And it's wonderful when you pass your test, but that true wisdom is turning around and helping somebody else pass theirs. And that's kind of what we strive to do. So please, by all means, share the channel, because life is very painful if you live in fog. That's why God doesn't want you to live in it. And you'll continue to make mistakes in life, but if you listen to the Holy Spirit, you listen to Lady Wisdom, it won't be this one anymore. Shalom, shalom.